I want to tell you something about memory, about the kind of forgetting that happens not because a thing is unimportant, but because it becomes invisible. I spent 31 years working for the town of Calvary, West Virginia, population 4,200 on a generous census day, maintaining water lines, patching the municipal building roof, replacing fluorescent tubes in the basement of the courthouse, and doing the kind of labor that only gets noticed when it stops. My name is Earl Henshaw. I am 59 years old, and 6 days ago I led 14 people into a place I helped build when I was 23 and hadn't thought about in over a decade. 9 of those people are still alive. The other 5 died not from what was outside, but from what I didn't tell them was wrong underneath. That's the part I need to confess. Calvary sits in a crease between 2 ridges, where the old rail spur used to run coal out of the mountain. The town grew around the rail, died when the rail left, and survived on stubbornness and a dollar store that somehow never closes. I was born here. My father worked the same municipal job before me. His father poured concrete for the WPA. Henshaw men don't leave Calvary. We just sink deeper into it, like fence posts in wet ground. In 1988, when I was fresh out of the vocational program and too broke to leave, the county received a federal grant to retrofit an old civil defense shelter beneath the elementary school. Cold War money, left over and late, funneled through some agency acronym nobody remembered. They needed local labor. I was local. I was cheap. I spent 14 months underground, pouring walls, running conduit, welding ventilation ductwork, and installing a filtration system that the engineers from Huntington designed, and I didn't fully understand. When we finished, someone from the state came, inspected it, hung a certificate on the wall of the county clerk's office, and left. The school held one drill. The children cried because the tunnel was dark. The teachers complained. No one went down again. The entrance was in the boiler room. Over the years, someone stacked supply boxes in front of the steel door, then filing cabinets, then a broken copier. The elementary school closed in 2011 when enrollment dropped below 40. The building became storage for the Parks Department. I moved mowers in and out of the gymnasium for a decade and never once thought about the door behind the cabinets. Until Tuesday, I first heard about the sickness the way everyone in Calvary hears about anything Dottie Skaggs at the post office, who monitors 3 police scanners and treats rumor as civic duty. Monday morning, she told me the National Guard had blocked Route 19 north of Summersville. She said there was a chemical spill. I didn't think much of it. By Monday afternoon, Dottie's story had changed. She said it wasn't a chemical spill. She said people were attacking each other in Charleston and the hospitals had closed their doors. I still didn't think much of it. Dottie once told me the water tower had been poisoned by the government, and it turned out a raccoon had fallen in the tank. But Monday night, the internet cut out, and that I noticed. I drove to the Gas and Go on the state road because Terry Bowman, who runs it, keeps a satellite television behind the counter. Terry was standing outside when I pulled in, which was unusual. Terry never stands outside. Terry once told me the sun was a personal inconvenience. He was watching the road, and when I got out of my truck, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him. Something between terror and apology. "Earl," he said, "I think we might be in real trouble." On the satellite TV, a Huntington news anchor was speaking over aerial footage of a highway I recognized, Interstate 64, near the Kanawha River Bridge. The bridge was burning. Not the way a car fire burns, but structurally, as though someone had tried to drop it on purpose. Along the riverbanks, between the smoke columns, I could see figures moving in patterns that made no sense. Staggering, converging, collapsing on shapes that I slowly realized were other people. Terry locked the door. I stood there for 40 minutes, watching the screen without speaking. I drove home at 11. I did not sleep. By morning, memory had begun its strange, urgent work. I woke at dawn on Tuesday, not because I had slept, but because lying in the dark had become unbearable. The house was cold. October in these valleys starts gentle and turns sharp overnight, and the furnace had been cycling badly for a week, another repair I'd been putting off. I made coffee on the stovetop because the power had gone out around 3 a.m. and hadn't returned. I drank it black, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the ridge and thinking about ductwork. That's how memory returned. Not as revelation, not as a flash, as ductwork. I was thinking about how the furnace intake pulled air from the crawl space and how that was inefficient. And that thought connected to another thought about air supply in closed systems. And that thought dropped through 35 years of forgetting and landed on a 14-month stretch of my life I'd buried under routine. The civil defense shelter, the ventilation specs, the air scrubbers that the Huntington engineers had been so proud of, the ones that could cycle and filter for a sealed population of 40 for up to 6 weeks. The water bladders plumbed into the municipal line with a gravity backup. The blast-rated door I had hung on its frame with a borrowed crane, while a man named Harmon Lusk read measurements off a clipboard and sweated through his shirt even though it was February. I set the coffee down. The shelter was still there. It had to be. I'd built those walls with 8-inch reinforced concrete. Nothing short of demolition would have removed them, and no one had demolished the old elementary school. It just sat there on Maple Street, holding mowers and old parade floats and whatever else the town needed to stop thinking about. I put on my coat and drove to the school. It was 6:40 a.m. The streets of Calvary were empty, which was not unusual for that hour. But the quality of the emptiness was different. No dogs barking, no porch lights left on. The Dollar General's parking lot sign was dark. At the intersection of Main and Route 20, the traffic signal was dead, swinging gently in a wind that smelled faintly of something I chose not to identify. The school's front doors were chained, but I had the key to the maintenance entrance on the east side. I'd had it for 15 years. I walked through the dim hallway, past classrooms converted to storage, past the old cafeteria stacked with folding tables, and into the boiler room. The filing cabinets were still there. The broken copier was still there. Behind them, rusted but intact, was the steel door. My hands shook as I moved the cabinets, not from fear, though fear was there. From something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing next to a piece of your life you'd managed to completely forget and realizing it had been waiting the entire time. The door's locking mechanism was mechanical, not electronic. A 6-point handle like a ship's hatch, designed to function without power. I gripped it. The metal was ice cold and gritty with oxidation. I pulled. It resisted. I repositioned my weight, braced a boot against the wall, and pulled again. Something cracked, not the mechanism, just years of settled grime releasing, and the handle turned. The air that came out was stale and mineral sharp. Limestone and old concrete and the ghost of machine oil. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and descended. 18 steps. I had poured every one of them. At the bottom, the corridor stretched 40 feet to a second door, this one lighter, unsealed. Beyond it, the main chamber opened up, 60 feet by 40, ceiling height 9 feet, exactly as I remembered. The cots were still folded against the wall. The water bladders hung flat and gray from their brackets. The air handling unit sat silent in its housing, like an engine waiting to be asked. I walked the space slowly. I touched the walls. I opened the mechanical room and found the filtration system. The backup generator wired for diesel. The exhaust channels I had welded myself on. Days I remember being hungover and too stubborn to call in sick. Everything was here. Everything was old. Everything would need to work. I sat down on a cot and stared at the ceiling I'd helped build when I was barely a man. And I began to calculate what it would take to make this place breathe again. I spent 4 hours in the shelter that morning, checking systems with the same diagnostic patience I'd applied to every water main and circuit panel in Calvary for 3 decades. The work calmed me. Concrete and steel don't panic. They just sit there being what they are, and you either understand their condition or you don't. The air handling unit was the priority. Without it, the shelter was just a decorated tomb. The main fan housing had surface corrosion, but the bearings turned when I applied force. The HEPA filters, military spec, sealed in their original housings, had degraded. I could see the discoloration through the inspection glass. They'd need replacement or bypass. The carbon scrubbers were a bigger concern. The activated carbon in the canisters had almost certainly lost absorption capacity after 3 decades. I opened one canister and confirmed it. The granules were powdery, spent not by use, but by time. The air system would move air, but its ability to clean it was compromised. I wrote this down in a pocket notebook I always carried. Then I checked the water system. The municipal line connection was dry, no pressure in the town system, which confirmed the infrastructure was already failing. But the gravity-fed backup cistern, a 2,000-gallon concrete tank built into the floor of the mechanical room, still held water. I tested it with a cupped hand. It smelled of minerals and age, but not of contamination. It would need to be treated. Bleach, boiling, or both. The diesel generator was a 15-kilowatt military surplus unit from the 1980s. It had sat without maintenance for decades. I checked the oil, black sludge. Fuel lines, dry-rotted. The diesel tank held approximately 40 gallons of fuel that had almost certainly gelled or separated. I could possibly get it running with fresh fuel, new lines, and an oil change. Possibly. The word sat heavy. The shelter could support life, but it could not at this moment support it safely. I climbed back up to the boiler room, sealed the hatch, and pushed the cabinets back in front of it. I don't know why I did that. Instinct, maybe. The impulse to hide what you found before deciding who to tell. Outside, Calvary had shifted. There were people on the street now, but they moved with a hurried, undirected quality, the movement of people who have received bad news and don't know what to do with their bodies. I saw Brenda Combs loading grocery bags into her car trunk, with the intensity of someone who expected the store to vanish. I saw Dale Ratliff standing on his porch with a hunting rifle, watching the road with the rigid posture of a man who had already decided what he would do if something came down it. I drove to the hardware store. It was open barely. Phil Denny, the owner, was behind the counter with the radio on, listening to a Beckley station that was broadcasting an emergency loop. The announcer's voice was flat and mechanical. Shelter in place. Avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Do not approach hospitals. Await further instruction. "Earl," Phil said, "you hear this?" I heard enough. "Elaine wants to drive to her sister's in Lewisburg. I told her the roads are probably closed." "They are. Summersville North is blocked. I'd guess South is the same by now." Phil looked at me the way people look at the maintenance man when the building is falling down, suddenly aware that the person who fixes things might be worth listening to. "What are you thinking?" I bought diesel fuel stabilizer, 2 cases of fuel line, a set of oil filters that were close enough to fit, 5 gallons of motor oil, a roll of HVAC tape, and 8 jugs of unscented bleach. Phil didn't ask why. He just rang it up and said, "You want to put this on the town account?" "Sure, Phil, put it on the town account." I loaded the truck and drove back to the school. As I pulled in, I saw 2 figures at the far end of Maple Street, near the Baptist church. They were walking, but the rhythm was wrong, loose and lurching, like marionettes operated by a hand that didn't understand joints. I watched them for 10 seconds, then carried the supplies inside and locked the door behind me. The arithmetic had changed. This was no longer theoretical. I told one person first, and I chose her carefully. Nora Jessup had been Calvary's town clerk for 22 years, and before that, she'd been an Army logistics specialist who deployed to the Gulf. She was 61 years old, built like a retired athlete who still took the stairs, and had a reputation for being the kind of calm that other people mistook for coldness. I knew better. Nora wasn't cold. Nora just didn't see the point in screaming when a spreadsheet would serve. I found her at the municipal building, sitting at her desk with the emergency binder open and the phone dead in its cradle. She was writing something by hand on a legal pad. "Nora? Earl?" She didn't look up. "Power's been out 5 hours. The backup generator at the water plant didn't kick. I've been trying to reach county emergency management on the radio, and I'm getting nothing but carrier." "I know a place." She looked up then. I told her about the shelter. I told her what I'd found, what worked, what didn't, and what I needed. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. And when I finished, she asked one question. "How many can it hold?" "Designed for 40. Realistically, with degraded systems, I'd say 20 to 25 if I can get the air moving properly." She tapped her pen against the legal pad twice. "Who else knows?" "Just you. Keep it that way until we assess. I'll get supplies from the emergency cache at the fire station. You get that generator running." That was our partnership, formed in 90 seconds and held together by the understanding that neither of us had time for anything more than function. I went back underground. Nora arrived 2 hours later with the fire station's emergency medical kit. 30 MRS from a National Guard surplus donation no one had ever collected. And a 19-year-old volunteer firefighter named Marcus Cole, who she said was the only other person she trusted to keep quiet and carry heavy things. Marcus was tall, cautious, and visibly afraid, which I respected more than bravery. Brave people make assumptions. Afraid people check corners. He helped me drain the old diesel, flush the fuel lines, and refill the generator tank with fresh fuel from a can Nora had siphoned from the fire truck. The generator coughed, stalled, coughed again, and on the 4th attempt turned over with a rattling, unhappy sound that was still the most beautiful thing I'd heard all day. The lights came on dim, yellowish, buzzing, and the air handling unit began to hum. I watched the vents, felt the movement against my palm. Air was circulating, but what it was doing to that air was the question I couldn't answer yet. By Wednesday evening, we had 12 people in the shelter. Nora had been selective, moving through town with a quietness that was almost surgical, collecting people she judged as useful or vulnerable. There was Dr. Annette Paris, Calvary's only remaining physician, semi-retired and sharp-tongued. There was Tom Birch, a high school chemistry teacher who took one look at the carbon scrubbers and told me what I already knew. They were decorative at this point. There was Ruth Greer, 74, who had survived a flood, a mine collapse that killed her husband, and breast cancer. and who sat on a cot in the corner with the unimpressed stillness of someone who had already met every version of the worst day. There were others, a young couple, Jenna and Sam, who had been passing through on the way to a wedding they would never attend. A mother named Diane Oakes, with 2 children, both under 10. A retired mining foreman named Clyde, who spoke very little and carried a toolbox that never left his hand. And then there was the 14th, who arrived not through Nora's selection but through accident. His name was Peter Calloway. He had been the school's last principal before it closed, and he had come to the building on Tuesday night looking for a shortwave radio he believed was stored in the old office. He'd found the hatch open. He'd walked down the stairs, and he'd seen everything. Peter was a problem from the first minute, not because of what he wanted, but because of who he believed he still was. Peter Calloway had been a man of authority in a building that had once been his kingdom, and the loss of that building had never fully registered in his psychology. He was 56, silver-haired, articulate in the way that school administrators learn to be every sentence structured to preempt disagreement. When he found us underground, his first words were not questions. They were assessments. "This is a public facility," he said, standing at the base of the stairs with his hands in his jacket pockets. "Built with federal funds, maintained or not maintained, apparently by the municipality, which means any decisions about its use need to go through proper channels." Nora looked at me. I looked at Nora. We had the same thought at the same time. This man is going to try to run things. "Peter," Nora said, in the voice she used for town council meetings when someone proposed something idiotic. "The proper channels are dead. The phones are dead. The county is dark. The National Guard has not come and is not coming. Earl found this shelter. Earl knows its systems. And Earl is the reason it's functional. So for the purposes of this particular emergency, Earl is the proper channel." I appreciated the vote, though it landed on me like a sandbag. I didn't want to be the proper channel. I wanted to be the mechanic. I wanted to fix the generator and check the water and keep my hands busy so my mind didn't have to think about the shapes I'd seen on Maple Street and what they meant about the world directly above our heads. Peter didn't argue, not directly. He nodded in a way that conceded nothing and said, "Of course, I'm just suggesting we establish some structure." He said structure the way some people say prayer, as though the word itself could organize reality. What Peter didn't know, and what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that the shelter was already structured around a flaw I hadn't solved. Tom Birch had confirmed it within hours of his arrival. The carbon scrubbers were dead. The HEPA filters were catching particulates, but not chemical or biological contaminants. The ventilation system was pulling outside air through intake channels that ran 30 feet up through the school's old mechanical chase and terminated in a vent on the roof. If the outside air was contaminated and we had no way to test whether whatever caused the infection was airborne, then we were breathing it. The sealed system that the Huntington engineers had designed in 1988 was only sealed if the filters worked. Without them, we were living in a pipe connected directly to the surface. I knew this. Tom knew this. I had asked him not to tell anyone until I figured out a solution. "If it's airborne," Tom said to me privately while the others settled into cots, "this shelter is theater. We feel safe because we're underground and behind a steel door, but we're breathing the same air as everyone up there." I know. So, what do we do? I'm working on it. I wasn't working on it. I was avoiding it. The problem was mechanical. The intake vents needed to be sealed, and the internal air recycled through some kind of filtration I hadn't yet invented, but sealing the intakes meant cutting off fresh air supply entirely, which meant CO2 buildup, which meant a different kind of death on a different clock. 14 people in a sealed concrete box consume oxygen at a rate that gives you hours, not days. The shelter needed outside air to survive. But outside air might be what would kill us. I lay on my cot that night and listened to 14 people breathe. Diane's children whispered to each other in the dark. Ruth Greer snored softly. Peter Calloway's cot creaked as he shifted, and I imagined him composing agendas in his sleep. Above us, through 60 feet of earth and concrete, the town of Calvary was going silent. I could feel it the way you feel a house cooling after the furnace dies, not a sound, but an absence that has weight. I had brought these people underground. I had not yet told them the ground might be lying. Tom Birch saved us, though not in the way heroes do in stories. He saved us in the way a chemistry teacher saves a lab experiment with duct tape, scavenged materials, and a theory he wasn't entirely sure would work. On Wednesday morning, while I was checking the generator's oil pressure and pretending the air system wasn't a death sentence, Tom pulled me into the mechanical room and closed the door. He had spent the night drawing diagrams on the back of old school attendance rosters he'd found in a storage closet upstairs. Calcium hydroxide, he said. What? Slaked lime. It absorbs CO2. Submarines used it before modern scrubbers. If we seal the intakes and recirculate internal airing through a calcium hydroxide bed, we can scrub carbon dioxide without needing outside air. It won't handle everything. We'll still get gradual oxygen depletion, but it buys us time. Days instead of hours. Where do we get calcium hydroxide? Tom smiled the grim, satisfied smile of a man who had found exactly one useful thing in the apocalypse. The garden center at Parsons Hardware. Agricultural lime. It's not pure calcium hydroxide, but close enough. We need about 80 pounds. The problem was obvious. Parsons Hardware was 6 blocks from the school, on the far side of Main Street. And Main Street was no longer safe. We had heard sounds overnight, not constant, but punctuated. A crash of glass. A scream that started high and ended in a wet sound I will not describe further. Footsteps on the street above, audible through the ventilation chase, dragging and arrhythmic. I decided to go at midday. The logic was thin but present. Whatever was happening seemed to intensify at night. Marcus volunteered immediately. Clyde, the retired mining foreman, stood up from his cot without a word, picked up his toolbox, and walked to the stairs. That was his way of volunteering. We went up through the boiler room and out the east maintenance exit. The daylight was wrong not in color but in context. The sun was shining on a town that had stopped functioning. And the contrast between the warm October light and the absence of human activity created a dissonance that made my chest tight. A car had jumped the curb on Maple and sat with its driver door open, engine dead. A grocery bag had split on the sidewalk, cans of soup rolling into the gutter. The Baptist Church's marquee still read Fall Festival October 25th in plastic letters. And I thought about how the person who put those letters up probably hadn't survived to take them down. We moved quickly. Marcus had a baseball bat from the school's old equipment closet. Clyde had a heavy wrench. I carried nothing but the truck keys and the awareness that I was the only person who could fix the filtration system, which meant I was the one who could least afford to die. This calculation disgusted me, even as I made it. We saw our first infected at the corner of Main and 2nd. A woman in a bathrobe, standing in the middle of the intersection, facing away from us. She was motionless, which was somehow worse than movement. Her posture was wrong, head tilted at an angle that suggested the muscles of her neck had reorganized themselves around a priority that wasn't balance. Marcus touched my arm and pointed. We detoured through the alley behind the hardware store. The garden center's side door was unlocked. Agricultural lime was stacked on pallets near the back wall. 50-pound bags, more than we needed. We loaded 4 bags into a wheelbarrow and added everything else Tom had requested: rubber tubing, plastic bins, mesh screen. Clyde found a battery-powered circular fan still in its packaging and held it up with a raised eyebrow. I nodded. The return trip took 11 minutes. We saw 3 more infected, 2 motionless, one moving slowly across a lawn, with the aimless determination of a wind-up toy winding down. None of them had noticed us, or if they did, they didn't react. Marcus watched them over his shoulder until we reached the school door. We sealed ourselves in and carried 80 pounds of agricultural lime into the future. Tom built the scrubber in 6 hours. He used the plastic storage bins as chambers, filled them with layers of calcium hydroxide spread across mesh screens, and ran recirculated air through them using the battery fan and a system of rubber tubing that connected to the existing ductwork. It was ugly, improvised, and held together with HVAC tape and optimism. But when I sealed the exterior intake vents, climbing into the mechanical chase with a wrench and 2 steel plates I'd cut from shelving, and the internal air began cycling through Tom's contraption, the CO2 readings on the detector Dr. Paris had in her medical kit stabilized within acceptable range. We were sealed. Truly sealed. For the first time. The bunker was now functioning as its designers intended, minus 35 years of maintenance and plus 1 chemistry teacher's jury-rigged substitute for military-grade scrubbers. I should have felt relief. What I felt instead was the beginning of a fear so specific and so technical that I couldn't share it with anyone except Tom. And even with him, I could only circle it. The calcium hydroxide would absorb CO2, but it was a consumable. It would saturate. Based on Tom's calculations, 80 pounds of agricultural lime, at our population density and activity level, would last approximately 8 to 10 days before it was spent. After that, CO2 would build. We'd get headaches first, then confusion, then drowsiness. Then we would stop breathing in our sleep. The schedule was gentle and invisible, which made it worse than any threat outside. I had sealed 14 people in a container with an expiration date, and I had not told them. This was the moral fracture. Not whether to let more people in that question, the one every survival story seems to obsess over, never really applied to us because no one else knew we were here. The fracture was simpler and more corrosive. Do I tell these people that safety has a countdown, or do I let them sleep soundly for as long as the chemistry holds? Tom and I discussed it in the mechanical room on Wednesday night, whispering over the thrum of the generator. They deserve to know, Tom said. If I tell them, Peter will use it. He'll argue the seal was a mistake. He'll want to reopen the intakes. He'll claim I endangered everyone. Didn't you? The question hung between us. I had no answer that didn't sound like an excuse. If the pathogen is airborne, I said, opening the intakes kills us faster than the CO2. If it's airborne, Tom said, we don't know that. We don't know it isn't. So the choice is between a definite threat on a timer and a possible threat we can't measure. Yes. Tom took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He was a careful man, a man who graded lab reports with a rubric and never rounded up. Uncertainty offended his nature. How much lime is it, Parsons? We took 4 bags. There were at least 20 more. Then we go back. We stockpile. We extend the window. And if the window still isn't enough? He put his glasses back on. Then we have a harder conversation. I agreed to the plan because it postponed the truth. And I'm not proud of that. Every day of silence was a day I chose comfort over honesty, control over trust. I told myself I was protecting them from panic. But panic is what happens when people discover they've been lied to. And I was building the conditions for exactly that. On Thursday morning, I organized a second supply run. This time, Nora insisted on coming. She brought a list of medications from the pharmacy, batteries, canned goods, water purification tablets. The run was larger, more exposed, and more dangerous. We would be gone longer. The infected population on the streets had grown since yesterday, and their behavior was shifting in ways I hadn't expected. But the Lyme was what mattered. The Lyme was time, measured in chemical reactions. And I needed every pound I could carry back into the earth. The four of us, Nora, Marcus, Clyde, and I, left at first light Thursday through the east exit. Nora carried a list in a backpack. Marcus had his bat. Clyde had his wrench and a grim, purposeful expression that never changed. I brought a hand truck from the school's maintenance closet for the Lyme bags. The town had deteriorated overnight in ways that weren't dramatic but were deeply unsettling. A house on Elm Street had burned to its foundation, smoke still threading from the rubble. The mailbox stood untouched at the curb, flag up, as though someone had mailed a letter before the fire and expected pickup. Windows along Main were broken from the inside, not the pattern of break-ins, but of things leaving. The smell was becoming specific. Organic decay layered under wood smoke. And something chemical I traced to a ruptured propane tank behind the diner. We reached Parsons Hardware without incident. The store was unlocked and undisturbed. I loaded the hand truck with 8 more bags of Lyme, 400 pounds, while Nora stripped the pharmacy 2 doors down of antibiotics, painkillers, and insulin for Ruth Greer, who was diabetic and hadn't mentioned it until the previous night. Marcus and Clyde worked the grocery aisles across the street, filling contractor bags with canned goods, crackers, peanut butter, and bottled water. The problem was the return. 400 pounds of Lyme on a hand truck makes noise on asphalt, and noise had become currency. We had observed that the infected responded to sound, not always, not reliably, but enough to establish a pattern. Sharp, sudden noise drew them. Sustained rhythmic noise held their attention. Silence was the only camouflage that worked consistently. We made it 3 blocks before the hand truck's wheel cut a crack in the sidewalk, and one of the bags shifted, thumping against the metal frame. The sound was modest, a dull, padded knock, but it was enough. A figure emerged from the open door of the barber shop 20 yards ahead. I recognized him. Hank Paulson, who had cut my hair for 15 years. He was wearing the same barber's smock he always wore, striped and buttoned to the neck, except now the stripes were obscured by a dark stain that extended from his collar to his waist. His movements had the quality I'd begun to associate with infection. Joints functioning but not coordinating. Each limb operating on a slight delay from the others, as though the signal between brain and body was being routed through damaged wiring. Hank turned toward us. His mouth was open, not in a scream or a snarl, but open, like a door left ajar by someone who'd left in a hurry. Marcus stepped forward with the bat raised. Nora put a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said. "Go around." We crossed the street, keeping the hand truck between us and Hank, moving with agonizing slowness to minimize sound. Hank tracked us with his head but didn't follow. His attention seemed to dissipate after 10 seconds, as though whatever impulse had drawn him outward lacked the architecture to sustain itself. He turned back toward the barber shop and stood in the doorway, facing nothing. We reached the school in 14 minutes. My shoulders were burning from the hand truck. We sealed the door and carried the supplies down. Tom met us at the bottom of the stairs with an expression I had learned to read. Something had happened. "Diane's son," he said quietly. "Coughing. Started an hour ago. Annette is with him." The boy's name was Kevin. He was 8 years old, with his mother's anxious eyes and a habit of folding paper into shapes that he'd line up along the edge of his cot with meticulous precision. A cough could be anything: dust, dry air, the stress of living underground. But in the current context, a cough was a verdict until proven otherwise. And every person in the shelter knew it. I could see it in their faces when I walked through the main chamber. The careful distance they'd already created around Diane's cot. The way conversations had pulled to the far wall. The geometry of fear arranging bodies in space. I set down the lime and went to find Annette. The shelter's timer was still ticking, but now it had a second hand. Dr. Annette Paris was 70 years old and had practiced medicine in Calvary for 40 of them. She had delivered babies in pickup trucks, set bones in kitchens, and once talked a man through a heart attack over the phone while driving to his house in a snowstorm. She did not speculate. She observed, measured, and stated what she found. And if what she found was ambiguous, she said so without apology. She was sitting beside Kevin's cot with a stethoscope pressed to his back when I arrived. Kevin was pale and irritable, the way children get when they're sick and want their own bed instead of a military surplus cot in a concrete room full of strangers. Diane stood behind Annette with her arms folded across her chest and her jaw set in the position of a mother preparing to fight anyone who suggested her child be removed. "Congestion in the lower right lobe," Annette said, pulling the stethoscope from her ears. "Low-grade fever. No rash, no altered behavior, no visible wound. It presents as a respiratory infection, which is exactly what I would expect from a child sleeping in a room with decades of concrete dust and inadequate air filtration." She looked at me when she said inadequate air filtration, and I understood the message. This was my problem. The environment I had offered these people was making them sick in ordinary ways. An ordinary sickness in extraordinary times is its own emergency. "Is it?" Diane started. "It is not whatever is happening outside," Annette said with the firm clarity of someone who has talked frightened patients down from cliffs for 4 decades. "It is a respiratory irritation aggravated by environmental conditions. I am going to treat him with antibiotics as a precaution and monitor his temperature. He needs fluids, rest, and cleaner air. The last one, Earl, is your department." I nodded and retreated to the mechanical room, where Tom was already modifying the scrubber system to incorporate the new lime supply. I told him about Kevin. "The lime handles CO2, he said. "It doesn't handle particulates. The old HEPA filters are catching some dust, but they're degraded. There's also mold potential in the water system. Those bladders have been sitting for 30 years. What do we need? New filter media. Or we need to reduce dust at the source, which means wet mopping every surface and sealing any exposed concrete that's spalling." It was grunt work, the kind of task I'd spent my life doing. I recruited Marcus and Clyde, and we spent Thursday afternoon on our hands and knees with wet rags, wiping down walls, floors, and ceilings. The water we used came from the cistern, treated with bleach, and every gallon spent on cleaning was a gallon not available for drinking. Another equation, another trade-off that felt like a slow form of violence against the people I was supposed to be protecting. While we worked, Peter Calloway held court. He had gathered Jenna, Sam, and 2 others near the supply stack and was speaking in his measured, administrative cadence about protocols and decision-making transparency. I heard phrases drift across the chamber. unilateral choices, accountability, the right of the group to be informed. Nora intercepted me before I could respond. "Let him talk," she said. "If you engage, you legitimize the idea that there's a debate to be had about who's in charge." There is a debate. He's having it. He's having it with himself. Everyone else in this room knows who's keeping the lights on and the air moving. Peter knows it too. That's why he's talking. She was right, but Peter's words planted seeds I could feel taking root. Because Peter, without knowing the specifics, was circling the exact truth I was hiding. He wanted transparency. He wanted information shared. And the information I was withholding, that the air system had a shelf life, that the shelter was a container with an expiration date, was exactly the kind of thing that, if revealed by Peter rather than by me, would destroy whatever trust this group had managed to build. I made a decision that night. Tomorrow I would tell them. All of it. Before Peter found a crack to pry open, I would open the door myself. It did not go the way I planned. Friday morning, I stood in the center of the main chamber and told 14 people the truth. I told them about the carbon scrubbers being dead. I told them about sealing the intakes. I told them about the calcium hydroxide and the window it created 10 to 12 days now, with the additional supply. I told them that when the lime was spent, CO2 would accumulate, and we would need to either unseal the intakes and accept whatever risk the outside air carried, or leave the shelter entirely. I did not soften it. I did not frame it as a problem we had already solved. I told them what I knew and what I didn't know, and let the silence that followed exist without filling it. The responses came in layers, the way they always do when a group absorbs bad news. First, silence. Then questions from the people who process through information. Tom confirming the timeline, Annette asking about symptoms of CO2 exposure, Clyde studying the ductwork with his foreman's eye. Then the emotional responses. Diane pulling Kevin closer, Jenna gripping Sam's hand, Ruth Greer closing her eyes and rocking slightly on her cot. Then, predictably and precisely on schedule, Peter. "You sealed the air intakes without consulting the group." "I did. You knew the lime had a finite lifespan, and you didn't disclose it." "I did. How long have you known?" "Since Wednesday." Peter turned to the room with the practiced pivot of a man who had spent his career performing authority. 2 days. For 2 days, the man who controls this facility withheld critical safety information from the people living in it. I want everyone to consider what that means about the decision-making structure we've accepted. Nora stepped forward. It means Earl used 2 days to solve the problem before it became a panic, which is what leaders do. Leaders are accountable. Leaders don't get to decide what the group is strong enough to hear. The argument that followed was the first real fracture. Not between me and Peter. That line had been drawn the moment he found the hatch, but within the group itself. Sam agreed with Peter. Jenna didn't. One of the quieter residents, a man named Floyd, who had barely spoken since arriving, said he wished he'd never been told at all. Ruth Greer opened her eyes and said, with the authority of someone who had survived 3 disasters, "The man built this shelter with his hands when he was barely older than Marcus. If he says seal the vents, I'll breathe whatever he tells me to breathe." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in years, and it made the guilt worse. Dr. Paris settled it, not with a speech, but with a question. "Earl, if you reopen the intakes right now, what happens?" "We get fresh air. CO2 ceases to be a problem. But if the pathogen is airborne, we're exposed." And if we keep the intake sealed, the lime gives us 10 to 12 days. After that, we open or we suffocate. So the question isn't whether to open, it's when. She had reduced the argument to its mechanical truth, stripped of ego and politics. Peter wanted a vote. Annette wanted a diagnosis. I wanted more lime and a laboratory and a 23-year-old version of myself who could crawl through ventilation shafts without his knees screaming. We compromised. Tom would monitor CO2 levels twice daily and post them on the wall for everyone to see. I would plan a third supply run for additional lime. And we would set a threshold. If CO2 reached 2,000 parts per million, we would partially unseal one intake vent and accept the risk, because the certain danger of suffocation outweighed the uncertain danger of contamination. Peter voted against the compromise. He wanted full unsealing immediately. He lost 14-1 and sat on his cot with his arms crossed, composing his next argument in silence. I had told the truth, and it had cost me. But it had cost me less than the lie would have. And that night, I slept for the first time in 3 days. Kevin's cough improved. Whatever Annette had prescribed antibiotics from the pharmacy run, fluid intake she monitored with maternal severity. And the cleaner air from our scrubbing work was effective. By Friday evening, he was sitting up, folding paper cranes, lining them along his cot rail with the focused contentment that children achieve when the world becomes small enough to manage. Diane's shoulders dropped 2 inches. The room's geometry relaxed. But other problems were building in the way that problems do when you put 14 strangers underground, silently, interpersonally, in the spaces between sleeping and waking. Jenna and Sam were arguing, not loudly. They were too aware of the room for that, but in the pressurized whispers that travel through concrete like water through limestone. She wanted to stay until the threat passed. He wanted to leave while they still could. Drive south toward her parents in North Carolina, take their chances on the road. The argument wasn't about strategy. It was about the question underneath every survival decision. Whose life do you prioritize when you can't save everyone's? Jenna wanted safety. Sam wanted his in-laws. Neither was wrong, and neither could give the other what they needed, which was certainty that the choice wouldn't kill them. I overheard more than I should have. Sound in the shelter was communal property. Every cough, every whisper, every nightmare vocalization was shared. Privacy existed only as a social agreement, a collective decision to pretend we hadn't heard what we'd heard. I became aware of Ruth's prayer routine. Quiet, rhythmic, spoken into her hands at 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. I learned that Marcus talked in his sleep, fragmented sentences about someone named Kayla, who I guessed was a girlfriend. Clyde ground his teeth. Floyd hummed country songs under his breath when he thought no one was listening, always the same 3 songs in the same order. These intimacies were uninvited and became inescapable. By Saturday, I knew these people better than I had ever known my neighbors, not through conversation, but through the involuntary broadcast of their private selves. It was a strange and uncomfortable kind of closeness, the opposite of friendship, intimacy without consent, knowledge without context. Peter used this, not maliciously, or at least not with the conscious intent of malice, but with the instincts of a man who had spent decades managing groups and understood that dissatisfaction was a resource. He positioned himself as the listener, Peter, the sympathetic ear, the one who sat beside Sam and nodded when Sam talked about leaving, the one who asked Diane if she felt her children's needs were being prioritized. He never contradicted me directly after the Friday confrontation. He simply made himself available as the alternative, the man who would have done things differently, who would have been transparent, who would have put the group first. It was effective. By Saturday evening, the shelter had developed the kind of quiet political geography that I recognized from every town council meeting I'd ever attended. 2 poles, each with gravitational pull, and a cluster of people in the middle trying not to be pulled. I didn't fight it because I didn't know how to fight it. I was a maintenance man. I fixed pipes and poured concrete and replaced ballasts. The machinery of human persuasion was as foreign to me as the machinery of this shelter was to Peter. We were each competent in domains the other couldn't reach, and the tragedy was that both domains mattered equally. On Saturday night, Tom's CO2 reading was 1,340 parts per million, up from 1,100 the day before. The trend line was clear, and it pointed to our threshold within 5 days. The lime was working, but 14 bodies produce a relentless tide of carbon dioxide. An agricultural lime applied through jury-rigged bins was not a military-grade scrubbing system. We were borrowing time at an interest rate that compounded with every breath. I lay awake and did what I always do when the problem is too large. I broke it into parts: the air, the water, the food, the people. 4 systems, each degrading at its own rate. The people were degrading fastest. Sunday morning, Marcus came to me in the mechanical room with a face that told me something had broken before he spoke. "Floyd's gone." "Gone where?" "Up. He left sometime in the night. The hatch was unlatched when I checked this morning." Floyd had been the quietest of us. A former truck driver in his mid-40s who had wandered into the school on Tuesday evening, dehydrated and disoriented, having walked from a jackknifed rig on the state road. He'd eaten, drank, slept, and spoken perhaps 200 words in 4 days. He hummed his country songs. He helped when asked. He never complained. And apparently, at some point during the night, he had decided that whatever was above was preferable to what was below. I went upstairs with Marcus. The east exit was closed but unlocked. We opened it and looked outside. The morning was cool, overcast, with a thin mist that blurred the tree line on the ridge. There was no sign of Floyd on Maple Street. No sound. No evidence of struggle. He had walked into the fog, and the fog had taken him. And the casualness of it, the simple, undramatic act of a man choosing to leave, was more frightening than any of the violence we'd witnessed. We sealed the door. I installed a secondary latch on the hatch, a bolt that could only be operated from inside the shelter. Not to imprison anyone, but to ensure that the next person who decided to leave would have to wake someone to do it. When I told the group, Diane cried. Not for Floyd specifically, she'd barely known him, but for the idea that safety could be voluntarily abandoned, which meant safety might be an illusion. Peter said nothing, which was his loudest statement yet. Nora pulled me aside afterward. "We need to talk about the air. The CO2 is at 1,340. We have time." "I'm not talking about the CO2. I'm talking about what the sealed system is doing to people's minds." She was right, and I hadn't wanted to see it. The shelter was psychologically toxic in ways the engineers had never considered. Because they'd designed it for a nuclear event, a scenario where the outside world was certifiably lethal. And the motivation to stay underground was absolute. Our situation was different. The outside world was dangerous, but navigable. People had seen us go out and come back. The contrast between the known claustrophobia of the shelter and the uncertain danger of the surface created a mental equation that shifted every hour. And for some people, for Floyd, for Sam, the equation had already tipped. "We can't keep people here by locking the hatch," Nora said. "We need to give them a reason to stay that isn't fear. The reason is survival." Survival isn't a reason, Earl. It's a condition. People need something to do, something to contribute, something that makes them feel like they're building toward a future instead of hiding from a present. I didn't understand then. I understand now. Nora was describing the difference between a shelter and a prison. And it wasn't the lock on the door, it was the presence or absence of purpose. A shelter protects you while you work towards something. A prison holds you while the world works without you. We had food, water, and filtered air, but we had no project, no direction, no answer to the question every person in that room was asking silently. What happens when we leave? That afternoon, Nora organized the group, not with authority or command, but with tasks. She assigned inventory management to Jenna, medical supply organization to Annette, water monitoring to Clyde. She asked Peter to develop an education schedule for Kevin and his sister, reading, math, whatever he could teach, and Peter, to my surprise, accepted with what appeared to be genuine engagement. She asked Marcus to map the town from memory, marking resources we hadn't yet collected. She asked Ruth to catalog what she knew about the local water table and growing seasons. The shelter didn't change that afternoon. The concrete was the same, the air was the same, the lime was degrading at the same rate. But the sound changed. People were talking to each other, not about fear, but about work. And that, I was learning, was a different kind of air filtration entirely. On Monday, our 6th day underground, we received information from the outside world for the first time since sealing the shelter. It came not through a radio or a signal or a rescue team, but through a woman named Grace Tierney, who pounded on the school's east exit door at 2 p.m. until the sound reached us through the ventilation chase. Marcus and I went up armed with wrenches and the kind of adrenaline that makes your vision narrow to a tunnel. Grace was standing at the door in a paramedic's uniform, stained with things I cataloged and chose not to identify. She was in her mid-30s, lean and sunburned, with the hollowed look of someone who had been running on cortisol for days. Behind her, the street was empty. "I can hear your generator," she said. "Through the ground." We brought her down. Annette checked her no fever, no wounds, no symptoms. Grace drank 2 bottles of water, ate an MRE with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling rather than eating, and then told us what she knew. She had been working with a National Guard medical unit that had set up a triage point in Summersville, 30 miles north. The triage point had been overrun on Wednesday, the same day we sealed the shelter. The guard had pulled back to a secondary position, then pulled back again, then stopped communicating. Grace had been driving south in an ambulance with 2 patients when the vehicle ran out of diesel on the edge of Calvary. Both patients had died during the night. She didn't say how. She had been moving on foot for 2 days, sleeping in cars, avoiding the infected, heading nowhere specific. The information she carried was more valuable than the medical supplies she'd brought from the ambulance. Grace had been in direct contact with military medical officers during the first days of the outbreak. She had heard their assessments before the communications collapsed. What she told us rearranged everything. The infection was not airborne. It was transmitted through fluid contact bites, open wounds exposed to contaminated blood, possibly mucous membrane contact. The airborne fear that had driven our entire ventilation strategy was unfounded. The sealed intakes, the lime, Tom's scrubber system, all of it had been a response to a threat that didn't exist into the form we'd imagined. I sat on the floor of the main chamber and listened to Grace describe the pathology as she understood it. A rapid onset neurological deterioration that destroyed higher brain function within hours, left motor function partially intact, and burned through the host's metabolic reserves at an accelerated rate. Infected individuals were consuming themselves. Muscle tissue broke down, organ function declined. The medical officers had estimated a functional lifespan of 10 to 15 days post-infection before the body simply failed. "They're dying," Grace said. "All of them. They're already dying from the moment they turn. The outbreak has a biological clock, and it's running out." The room was silent. Tom looked at me. I looked at Tom. We had sealed 14 people in a box with deteriorating air to protect them from a threat that traveled through blood, not breath. The engineering had been correct in principle and wrong in premise, and the wrongness had nearly suffocated us. I stood up and climbed to the mechanical room. I unbolted the steel plates I'd installed over the intake vents. Fresh air, October mountain air, clean and cold, and carrying the smell of decaying leaves, flooded the system. The fans caught it and pushed it through the ductwork, and I heard it fill the chamber below, like a long-held breath being released. When I came back down, people were standing under the vents with their faces turned upward, breathing. Diane's daughter was laughing. Marcus had his eyes closed. Ruth Greer was crying. Though whether from relief or from grief for the days of stale air she'd endured without complaint, I couldn't tell. Peter Calloway caught my eye across the room. He didn't speak, but he nodded once. And in that nod was something I hadn't expected. Not vindication, not accusation, but a recognition that we had both been wrong about different things, and that wrongness, in this case, had not been fatal. Grace's information changed the calculus from endurance to countdown. If the infected had a 10 to 15-day functional window, and the outbreak had reached Calvary approximately 6 days ago, then the threat outside had somewhere between 4 and 9 days remaining. The variation was significant. 4 days was manageable, 9 was uncertain, but the principle was transformative. This would end, not through intervention or rescue or human action, but through biology consuming itself. The shelter shifted, not immediately, not all at once, but in the way a room changes when someone opens a curtain. The anxiety didn't vanish. It relocated. Instead of fearing the present, people began fearing the future. What would they find when they went up? Whose houses were still standing? Whose families had survived in other towns, other states? The questions that had been suppressed by the immediacy of survival began surfacing with increasing frequency. And they carried a weight that no amount of fresh air could dissolve. Grace integrated into the group with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis teams. She took over medical duties alongside Annette, inventoried our pharmaceutical supplies, and established a basic health monitoring protocol. Temperature checks twice daily, wound inspections, cognitive assessments disguised as conversation. She was practiced at this, the quiet surveillance of people under stress, watching for the cracks that appear not in emergencies, but in the spaces between them. She found one on Tuesday morning. Sam had stopped eating. Not dramatically, he still sat with the group during meals, still held food, still performed the motions. But Grace noticed he wasn't swallowing. The food went to his mouth and came back to his plate, rearranged, but unconsumed. She told me privately, and I watched him myself and confirmed it. I sat beside him that afternoon. Sam was 28, an electrician from Morgantown, the kind of practical young man who fixes things and doesn't talk about himself. He and Jenna had been driving to her cousin's wedding in Virginia when the roads closed, and they'd been funneled into Calvary by detour signs that led nowhere. Sam, he looked at me with the flat, depleted expression of someone who had run out of the energy required to maintain a social face. "Yeah. Grace says you're not eating." I eat. She says you don't. He was quiet for a long time. In the shelter, a long silence was a luxury that the group's constant ambient noise rarely permitted. But the others were occupied. Nora's task assignments had distributed people throughout the space, and our corner was temporarily private. I keep thinking about the drive down, Sam said. We passed through this little town I don't even know its name. There was a woman on the shoulder of the road with a baby in a car seat, flagging us down. Jenna said stop. I didn't stop. You couldn't have known. I knew enough. I'd heard the radio. I knew something was wrong. And I looked at that woman and her baby, and I did the math, and I kept driving. I didn't tell him it was the right decision. I didn't tell him it was wrong. I told him that guilt is a living thing, and that if you don't feed it the truth, it feeds on you instead. I told him the woman might have been fine. I told him she might not have been. I told him that not knowing was the specific punishment of every choice made at speed, and that carrying it was the tax on survival. He started eating again that evening. Not because of anything I said, I'm not that eloquent, and I know it, but because Jenna sat next to him and put her hand on his arm and said, I need you here, Sam. All of you. Not the part that's still on that road. Love is a mechanical advantage. It doesn't eliminate the weight. It changes the angle at which you carry it. I watched them and thought about my ex-wife, Carol, who had left Calvary 11 years ago and taken with her the last person who might have put a hand on my arm and said something similar. I hoped she was somewhere safe. I hoped she had someone. I turned back to the generator and tightened a bolt that didn't need tightening. Wednesday was quiet in the way that only underground places can be quiet. A thick, padded silence that absorbs anxiety and replaces it with a low-grade hum of waiting. The CO2 levels had dropped to 800 parts per million with the intakes open. Kevin was building an elaborate paper city along the wall. Ruth was teaching Marcus how to identify edible plants from descriptions alone. Using a field guide that Nora had grabbed from the library during one of the supply runs, Clyde was reinforcing the hatch mechanism with steel brackets he'd fabricated from shelving, not because anyone asked, but because Clyde expressed care through metalwork. Tom approached me in the mechanical room with a composition notebook filled with calculations. I've been thinking about what happens after, he said. After the infected collapse. After we surface. The infrastructure is gone, Earl. Water treatment, electrical grid, supply chains. Even if every infected person drops dead tomorrow, Calvary doesn't have the systems to sustain itself. The water plant requires electricity. The electricity requires fuel delivery. The fuel delivery requires roads and trucks and a functional economy. Every system depends on a system that depends on another system, and they've all failed simultaneously. I knew this. I had been avoiding this. The shelter had consumed my attention so completely that I'd treated the surface world as a problem to be deferred. But Tom was right. Emerging from the shelter into a dead town was not rescue. It was relocation from one survival problem to another. What are you proposing? We start planning now. Inventory what Calvary has: wells, generators, stored fuel, agricultural land, seed stock, tools. Map it, prioritize it, so that when we surface, we're not starting from zero. It was the first conversation that treated the future as real, and it spread through the shelter like warmth. Nora took it and ran. Within hours, she had created a planning board on the wall using paper and tape, dividing post-emergence needs into categories: water, food production, shelter and structures, medical capacity, communication, and security. She assigned each person an area based on their knowledge. Peter took communication. He knew the school's shortwave radio setup, and more importantly, he knew the repeater network that the emergency management office had installed on the ridge above town years ago. If the repeater still had battery backup, he might be able to reach other survivors, other towns, other groups, anyone still transmitting. He dove into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised me, and I realized that Peter's problem had never been malice. It had been purposelessness. He was a man designed for administration, trapped in a scenario that required plumbing. Giving him a domain to administer was like putting fuel in an engine that had been running on fumes. Grace contributed something none of us had: first-hand knowledge of the broader crisis. She drew a map of what she'd seen: the guard positions, the triage routes, the communities she'd passed through, and overlaid it with information she'd gathered from other survivors during her 2 days of walking. The picture was grim but specific. Charleston was dark. Beckley had fires visible from 20 miles. But smaller communities in the mountain valleys, places like Calvary, isolated by terrain, had pockets of survival. People were alive out there, scattered, doing what we were doing, hiding, waiting, beginning to plan. The planning changed something in me that I hadn't realized needed changing. Since Tuesday, I had been operating in a mode I now recognize as controlled desperation, managing each hour, each system, each crisis as it emerged, without any framework beyond the next problem. Planning introduced a horizon. Not hope exactly. Hope felt premature and dangerous, but directionality. The difference between drifting and navigating isn't speed or skill. It's knowing which way you intend to go. That evening, for the first time, the shelter felt less like a shelter and more like a headquarters. The distinction was invisible from outside, but structural from within. A shelter is where you hide. A headquarters is where you decide what to do next. I was starting to think about what came next. On Thursday, day 9, we opened the door. Not to leave, not yet. To look. Grace and I went up through the hatch at midday, climbed through the boiler room, and stood at the east exit, listening before we opened it. The silence outside was different from the silence of previous days. It lacked the tension of presence. It felt like the silence after a storm, when the air is still disturbed, but the disturbance has moved on. We stepped outside. The October sun was high and thin. Maple Street was empty. The car that had jumped the curb was still there, door open, battery long dead. Leaves had accumulated against it in a russet drift. Down the block, a dog trotted across the intersection, alive, intact, unbothered. It glanced at us and continued with the indifference of an animal that had already recalibrated its understanding of the world. We walked 2 blocks. The evidence of what had happened was everywhere, but the agents of it were diminished. We found 3 collapsed forms on Main Street bodies in the advanced stage of whatever metabolic consumption Grace had described. I won't detail what they looked like, except to say that the process was thorough, and that the human form, reduced to its base materials, becomes something your brain refuses to classify. You see it, and your vision slides off, seeking anything else to focus on. We found 1 infected individual still animate, sitting against the wall of the post office. A man, though identification was no longer possible. His movements were minimal, a slow oscillation of the head, fingers twitching against the pavement in a pattern that might have been random or might have been the last electrical signals of a nervous system shutting down. He did not react to us. Grace approached within 10 feet, observed him clinically, and stepped back. "Hours," she said. "Maybe less." We returned to the shelter, and I reported what we'd found. The response was not celebration. It was a collective exhale that carried as much grief as relief. The infected were people. They had been our neighbors, and their dissolution was not a victory. It was the final expression of a catastrophe that had taken everything from them, including the dignity of a recognizable death. We established a rotation. 2 people above for 4 hours each day, monitoring conditions, cataloging resources, and beginning the grim work of documenting what remained. The documentation was Nora's idea. She said that whatever came next would require records of who had survived, of what was available, of what had been lost. She said that civilization was, at its foundation, an act of record-keeping, and that rebuilding began with acknowledging what had been destroyed. Peter made contact on Friday. The school's shortwave radio was water-damaged, but functional after he replaced the power supply with a battery from the ambulance Grace had abandoned. The Ridge repeater was still operational, running on solar backup. And through it, Peter reached a community 30 miles southeast, a group of 52 people sheltered in a church and its adjacent buildings, organized around a former emergency management coordinator who had been running the same arithmetic we had. The voice on the radio was thin and tired and alive. Peter spoke to them for 40 minutes, exchanging information with the structured efficiency of a man who had finally found his proper role. When he finished, he came to me in the mechanical room where I was servicing the generator for what I knew would be one of the last times. "They want to coordinate," he said. "Supply sharing, medical resources, communication relay. They've been in contact with 2 other groups further south." "Okay," he hesitated. "Earl, I owe you something." "You don't." "I do. I spent a week trying to undermine you because I needed to feel like I was in charge of something. And the only way I knew how to get that was to take it from you. That was wrong." I looked at him. His face was drawn, his silver hair unwashed, his administrative composure replaced by something raw and more honest. "Peter, you weren't entirely wrong. I withheld information. I made unilateral decisions. You pushed back, and some of that push was deserved." He offered his hand. I shook it. It wasn't friendship. It was the thing that comes before friendship, when 2 people agree to stop keeping score. Saturday, day 11. We began going up in groups. Not to leave the shelter permanently, the infrastructure planning wasn't ready for that, but to work. There were bodies to address, resources to secure, buildings to assess. The town of Calvary needed triage of its own. I led the first full-surface team: Marcus, Clyde, Grace, and myself. Our task was the water plant, a small facility on the north end of town that drew from a mountain spring and served Calvary's municipal system. I had maintained its equipment for 20 years. I knew every valve, every pump, every junction box. The plant was intact. The building was locked, undamaged, apparently untouched by the crisis. Whatever had consumed Calvary had passed through its residential and commercial areas like a flood through a valley, following the paths of human density and leaving the peripheral infrastructure alone. The spring was still flowing. The treatment system was offline but mechanically sound. The backup generator, a twin to the one in the shelter, installed the same year, had fuel in its tank. I spent 3 hours bringing the plant back online. Marcus handed me tools with the attentiveness of someone who had decided to learn what I was doing, rather than merely assist. Clyde inspected the building's structure with his foreman's eye and declared it sound. Grace stood watch outside, scanning the streets with the habitual vigilance of someone who would never fully trust a quiet road again. When the pump engaged and water began flowing through the treatment system, I stood at the monitoring panel and watched the pressure gauges climb, and I felt something I need to describe carefully because it was not simple. It was not pride, though pride was in it. It was not relief, though relief was its foundation. It was the sensation of function, returning to a system. I understood the mechanical satisfaction of components operating in sequence, combined with a crushing awareness that this was all I'd ever been to Calvary. The man who kept the water running. The man who maintained the systems everyone else took for granted. I had spent 31 years being invisible, and the apocalypse had not changed what I was. It had only made what I was temporarily visible. We secured the water plant, locked it, and moved to the gas station on the state road. Terry Bowman's Gas and Go had been looted, the front windows smashed, shelves cleared. But the underground fuel tanks were intact, accessed through a fill port in the parking lot that required a key I happened to have. Because I had been the one to install the lock 11 years ago when the county mandated security upgrades. We tested the fuel. Viable. Diesel in one tank, gasoline in the other, enough combined to run generators and vehicles for weeks. Walking back through town with the afternoon light cutting low through the valley, I saw Calvary the way you see a patient after surgery wounded. Still uncertain, but with vital signs that suggested continuation was possible. Houses stood. Roads were passable. The infrastructure I'd spent my life maintaining was damaged, but not destroyed. And the knowledge of how to restore it lived in my hands and in my memory and in 31 years of municipal service that had never once earned me more than a polite nod at the grocery store. Back at the shelter, I reported our findings. Nora updated the planning board. Tom calculated water treatment capacity against estimated survivor population. Peter coordinated with the community to the southeast, establishing a supply-sharing protocol. Annette inventoried medical supplies, so against projected needs. Every person had a function. Every function mattered. Diane's children asked if they could go outside. Diane looked at me. I looked at Grace. Grace nodded. We took them up. Kevin stood in the school parking lot and looked at the sky as though he had been underground for years instead of 9 days. His sister held his hand and pointed at a bird, a hawk, circling on a thermal above the ridge, and said, "Look," with the uncomplicated wonder of a child who does not yet understand what has been lost, only that there are still things worth seeing. I watched them and felt the weight of what the shelter had cost pressing against the possibility of what the surface might offer. We emerged fully on Monday, day 13. Not because it was safe, the word had lost its absolute meaning, but because the shelter had served its purpose, and extending our stay would have meant choosing confinement over the difficult, necessary work of reconstruction. The morning was cold. November had arrived while we were underground, and the first frost had silvered the grass and the rooftops, and the still figures that we would spend the coming days addressing with the respect and gravity they deserved. Nora had prepared a protocol for this, because Nora prepared protocols for everything: identification, documentation, burial. She had assigned teams. She had mapped the cemetery. She had even, in her thorough and unsentimental way, considered the logistics of digging graves in ground that was beginning to freeze. I descended into the shelter one last time to shut down the generator. The silence that followed its shutdown was the deepest silence I had ever experienced, the absolute quiet of a concrete chamber with no mechanical heartbeat, no human breath, no purpose. I stood in the main chamber where 14 people had slept and argued and planned and broken down and rebuilt themselves. And I looked at the paper cranes Kevin had left lined along the wall. He'd made 47 of them. I counted. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. Outside, the group had gathered in the school parking lot. 15 people, our original 14 minus Floyd, plus Grace standing in the frost, facing a town that needed everything. The southeastern community had confirmed by radio that they were sending a small team with medical supplies and seed stock. 2 other groups had been contacted. A network was forming, fragile and tentative, held together by short-wave signals and the shared understanding that isolation was a luxury no one could afford. Peter was organizing a communication schedule. Nora was distributing task assignments for the week. Tom was explaining soil chemistry to Marcus, who had expressed interest in the agricultural planning with a seriousness that suggested the young man had found something he wanted to build. Annette was examining Ruth's ankle, which had swollen during the climb up the stairs. Grace was already walking toward the ambulance she'd abandoned, checking whether any remaining supplies were salvageable. I stood slightly apart, which was my natural position, the peripheral man, the one who watches systems rather than people. Clyde appeared beside me with his toolbox and said the first full sentence I'd heard from him in 13 days. Water plant'll need a new intake filter before winter. I know. I can fabricate one if you show me the specs. I'll draw them up tonight. He nodded and walked toward the street with the purposeful stride of a man who had identified his next task. I watched him go and understood that this was what recovery looked like. Not a moment of triumph, but a sequence of small, specific jobs performed by people who had decided, individually and without ceremony, to continue. The shelter would remain. I would maintain it, as I maintained everything in Calvary, because that was what I did and who I was. It would serve as storage, as emergency backup, as a reminder of what had been endured. The hatch would stay accessible. The generator would be serviced. The walls I had poured at 23 would hold whatever the future required them to hold. I walked to the water plant to check the morning readings. The route took me down Main Street, past the damaged storefronts and the debris, and the evidence of a catastrophe that was still being measured. The sun was rising over the eastern ridge, and the frost was beginning to melt. And somewhere behind me, in the school parking lot, I could hear Kevin's voice asking Diane if he could explore. She said yes. But stay where I can see you. The ordinary negotiation of a mother and child, spoken in a town that had nearly ceased to exist, carrying forward the assumption that tomorrow was worth preparing for. I opened the plant door with my key. I checked the gauges. I adjusted a valve. I wrote the readings in my notebook. The work continued because I continued, and I continued because there was work. They'll forget again. I know this because I know Calvary. And I know how people treat the things that keep them alive. The water will run, and they won't think about the pipes. The lights will come on, and they won't think about the wiring. The shelter will sit beneath the school, quiet and dark. And within a year or two, someone will stack boxes in front of the hatch, and it will become invisible again. The way infrastructure always becomes invisible when it functions correctly. I'm not bitter about this. I was once. I spent 30 years resenting the fact that no one noticed the work I did until it stopped working. But 13 days underground taught me something I hadn't expected. Invisibility is the highest form of competence. The things you never have to think about are the things someone is maintaining perfectly. 5 people died in that shelter. Not from the infected, from bad air. I sealed them in, because I was wrong about how the pathogen traveled. I carry this. I will carry it into every repair I make, every valve I turn, every system I bring back to life. The debt is structural, load-bearing, permanent. My name is Earl Henshaw. I maintain things. That is enough.